Imagine yourself under a starry sky, around the warm glow of a sacred fire, where speakers gather to share their wisdom and insights. Creating a sacred space where all are welcome to warm their hands. Here are your hosts, Sarenth Odinson, Snow, Cabra, and Emily Streaking Fate. Discuss spirituality, mythology, animism, and culture around a virtual sacred fire. Won't you join us around Grandfather Fire?
Io Hermes, Pantocrator, Thoth, Jehuti, you who gives wisdom, you who oversees scripture and writing and script, you of great magic, you of travel and journeys, Psychopomp, messenger, divine one, teacher, Hermes the thrice great, alchemist, magician, and teacher. Hail to you in our studies, in our magic, in our travels, literal, metaphorical, emotional, spiritual. Hail Hermes who grants wisdom upon the scribes and the translators and the scholars. Hail Hermes as the scholars and academics grant and transmit knowledge and learning to others, that all may partake in your gifts and blessings. Hail Hermes.
Welcome to another round of Around Grandfather Fire. This is episode 152 with my good friends and co-hosts Snow and Emily Streaking Fate. How are you both doing today?
I am good. I am recovering from jet lag from traveling to the States and not sleeping on the 9.5 hour flight back. And then going straight back to work because that's how life is. And so the second that I stop and go, the weekend is here, my body goes, surprise, have a cold. So that was fun. Uh, Otherwise, I'm okay.
Naturally. Of course it does.
Yeah, yeah, of course. It's just how life goes. How are you, Emily?
I am doing all right. My body has needed a little more rest time and downtime this week than I was hoping for, but overall it's been a good week. Just some extra naps, some extra sleep, and some extra hydration. What about you, Saranth?
Oh, let's see. Uh, it has been a bit of a busy week, between various appointments and having to keep them. But overall, this week has gone a lot smoother than I was originally thinking it was going to. So, praise the Gimdragon for that. The other big thing that I've been working on has been the upcoming workshop that I've got this weekend, which is the basics of heathen magic. So I've been working on finalizing the presentation for that. Um, the the script document for that is about 19 pages long, and the what do you call that thing? Is flashes the slides across. The slideshow, right. Uh, that is about 64 slides or more. Last, no, 66 slides. So that'll be fun. I'm looking forward to that one. I saw we had a bunch of new people sign up, so I'm looking forward to it even more. So that's really what's been on my mind this week is getting all that stuff nailed down.
That's really cool. And it's cool that you're making so much progress
Thank you.
there.
Um, I was curious
Uh,
to ask how your trip went. Yeah,
how did my trip go? My trip was good. I had an 11-hour
Jesus.
flight out and a 9.5 hour flight back. It is a long way from here to the west coast of the States. Uh, it was a wonderful, magical time. I got to spend 2 and a bit weeks with my partner and meet some of her family and see much of the wonderful flora and fauna that the Americans take for granted until a European person goes, "Oh my God, it's a hummingbird." And they go, "Well, yeah." And you go, "They don't exist outside the Americas. I have not seen one before in
Oh,
person.
that's
This is
cool.
surreal." So that was cool. I had a similar experience when I looked out the window and went, "Holy shit, that's a coyote." And people are going, "Yeah, yeah, no, we get those here." And I'm like, "Yeah, we don't. That's a coyote."
It's like having a little
So that was really
celebrity outside
cool.
your house every time you open up your door.
It was really great, yeah. And I got to see wild American rabbits, you know. They eat grass with an accent. Um, and I got to see American gray squirrels. They bury nuts with an accent. Um, and we got to see a doe, a deer, a female deer. Um, so that was cool. It was very big. It was like taller than me, and I'm 6'2" ish. So that
Everything's
was
big here in
impressive.
America.
And then it ran, yeah. And then it ran away into the woods because someone went, "Did you get a photo?" And I went, "Well, if we'd got a photo, it would have been one of those ones where I'm showing people the picture going, 'No, I promise if you squint that bit there that you think is a branch and a shadow, no, I'm telling you, that was the deer.'" Uh, so yeah, that happened. Uh, yeah, no, it was really cool. Chinatown in San Francisco is amazing. Would recommend to people who like Chinatowns or Chinese stuff or just stuff. If you like stuff, go to Chinatown in San
Never
Francisco.
been to it. Never been to a Chinatown
It's
at all, so this is going to be
some
an
of
interesting thing for me.
I mean, both of us said it was some of the best Chinese food we'd ever had ever.
Excellent.
It was really cool. What else? Introduce some of my partner's friends to sake because what else does your European bring to American friends? I go, "Here, have some Japanese rice wine." What else am I gonna do? Naturally. Um, Although it was kind of cool the last time that Claire was out here, she did go back with a carrier bag full of
Nice.
tea. And so she was hosting tea tasting parties for her friends. So I get over there and they're like, "Okay, we've learnt about tea."
So they didn't offer you anything in bags?
Uh, Nothing that the TSA would let me bring
Damn,
back to the UK. Yeah,
that's unfortunate.
uh, such is life. I met up with
Oh,
Reverend
cool.
Eric again, of the Arnemancy podcast, who has been on AGF before. And once again, I will say, however much he says that we drank is an exaggeration in either direction, but a good time was had. My partner herding us down the pavement to make sure we didn't walk into traffic. It was a good time. You know, what else are you going to do? So, yeah, no, it
Excellent.
was a good trip. Yeah. And I'll be back in July, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't quite that kind of hurting, but this morning, Emily and I went out with my folks to the local greenhouse to get ideas for the garden. And so one of the things we brought back were 3 packets of different kinds of seeds for herbs we were interested in planting: sage, rosemary, and thyme. Um, Sadly, could not complete the song on this trip.
And get parsley.
Next time.
When you're going to Scarborough Fair,
Thank you.
I wouldn't bother going to Scarborough if I'm honest. I've
Mm.
been and if you like a touristy seaside town that's completely packed full of people wanting cheap chips and ice
I
cream,
mean, I've been
then
to Salem,
sure.
so it's kind of like
But
that, but with the witchy hats. So
oh, the capital of Oregon. Cool.
not quite. I was thinking more Salem, Massachusetts, but sure.
Uh, it's the problem with America. They keep reusing names. There's only like 3 place names in the States, and they just use them over and over and
I
over.
dare you to find more than one town in America named Ypsilanti, but that's just. I'm
I'm
sure
sure
you
I could
probably
if I
could,
tried.
because
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of
God,
Springfields.
yes.
Yeah.
So, Snow, would you like to introduce
Mm.
our wonderful guest who has been patiently waiting for us?
I would love to. I have been really excited about getting this guest on. This is someone whose work I have copy pasted all over my blog for years and referenced a lot and linked to a lot and recommended a lot. So I would love to introduce her. So this is largely taken from her website. So if she's sitting there thinking this sounds familiar, that'll be why. Gaia Martiana is an independent scholar of the ancient Mediterranean, specifically of the philosophical and grammatical literature of the so-called late antique period. Her work includes translations from Greek and Latin of ancient philosophical treatises available on her website, Sartrix. Sartrix is an online encyclopedia and public library devoted to ancient Mediterranean polytheism in the sense of the greater Mediterranean, albeit centered on the Greco-Roman. Following the precedent of Thomas Taylor, it is written from the perspective and for the benefit of modern practitioners above all, but with the same academic standards as any reliable secular resource. So, Martiana, welcome to Around Grandfather
Thank
5.
you. Lovely to be here.
So, I guess first off, how did you get started in studying philosophy?
Um, well, I don't know. I've always been interested in philosophy, I suppose. Um, I could more easily explain how I got interested in philology, which was that I wanted to be an actor, and so I thought, well, I better read a lot of plays, and I started with the Greeks, and then I just kind of got stuck there. And I had taken Latin in school from pretty early on, but it was not exactly my favorite subject. But then, those things kind of came together, and so yeah, I went to uni to study Greek and Latin, and philosophy has always been one of my main interests. I suppose because it intersects so much um, with religion and paganism, obviously, uh, has always been the thing that interests me most in ancient texts, I think.
So, how did you sort of come to paganism and ancient religion then?
Um, that's a good question as well. um, I think I've just always found it interesting on like I suppose an aesthetic or intellectual level. And I've always been attracted to the practice and the theory without necessarily uh, believing things as sort of they're more most commonly explained or defined or understood. And at some point, I just sort of decided, well, if I keep reading these texts and I'm interested in these practices, it doesn't really matter that much how I understand them. I'm just gonna accept that this is sort of what I do, that this is what I do practice and in whatever way do uh, believe in.
That's really interesting because I know that we see a lot of people in sort of pagan and occult spaces who really struggle with the idea of when to say they're properly doing something. And so they sit there kind of struggling with how much do they need to understand to really get going and identify with the thing or kind of adopt an identity or engage with a practice. So it's interesting to hear that you kind of took that approach.
Yeah, and I have to admit that I don't do a lot of practice just for, or I should say, um, like offerings and this sort of thing. Um, just because I'm not very good at keeping up with like regular tasks. So for me, it's very much that translation and research and study are sort of my primary way, I would say, of devotion.
So I suppose one of the main things that people often point to or think of when they look through Sartrix, either the current website or your old WordPress site, is often the Platonism and your sort of translations and commentary of a lot of Platonic things. So I suppose, how did you get into Platonism? Was that also through looking at ancient Greek plays then?
Well, yeah, that was the starting point, and then I'm not really sure how I got to philosophy specifically. Um, After school, I did a year of I'm not sure how to put it in English, but like I worked at a school for a year before I went on to university. And so in like the last year or years of school, and then during that year, I just read a lot of different ancient and medieval and Greek, Roman, Norse, also other things, but just sort of a very broad variety of things that a lot of it I probably understood very poorly at the time. But some of what I read was Porphyry of Tyre, who is an important early Neoplatonic philosopher, and then also Iamblichus. And I read the Greek magical papyri, and I saw sort of the close relationship there between that sort of theory in the Platonic philosophers, and then the practice in these magical texts. And I guess I got sort of stuck on those two topics. Uh, they just exerted, I don't know, more of an attraction than a lot of other things.
So I suppose then, would you consider yourself a Platonist?
And not really, no. I
Okay.
I find how do I put this? I find sort of the very developed Neoplatonic theory in Proclus uh, is almost like a complete theory of how the world sort of seems to be to people, because we know that people have a lot of experiences that can't be empirically verified. Um, and Proclus just sort of starts with the assumption that those are all basically real, and then he tries to come up with a single system of how all of these beliefs and experiences and traditions make sense in a single system. And so I think in that sense, it's sort of a good way to navigate um, paganism, because it can sort of account for everything, but kind of because it's that need of a system, it's it seems very unlikely to me that it's at all true, um, because I don't think that we can really, as humans, that we'd have a very good shot of actually understanding everything as a complete and coherent system. Um, but for those purposes where we sort of practically want or need a system, then Proclus or the other Neoplatonists are a very good way of approaching things, where other philosophers, um, maybe in some respects, seem to me to be closer to the truth, but they have a lot less. They don't have as rich a way of engaging with specifically like religious questions, questions of practice, questions of how to understand the gods. Um, and so I suppose a richer understanding is, in a sense, more useful, even if it maybe isn't exactly true, than something that is maybe true, but also so vague that it doesn't really let you approach things in a practical way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It brings to mind, when you're going to cook, like you've got certain ingredients that work really well together and certain ingredients that really don't. And trying to parse, well, what makes this cake rise really well? What makes the cake taste really good? Some of this is a matter of taste, but some of it's just a matter of experimentation. So that, from a practical standpoint of figuring out which philosopher, because the question I was going to have as a follow up was like, what's your favorite philosopher? Um, and
Um,
why?
okay, well, I mean, big picture, Karl Marx or something, but if we're sticking to ancient philosophy, um, I do like Proclus a lot because he has this sort of all-encompassing vision of like a single coherent system in a way that I don't think really anyone else in antiquity has. On the other hand, I find people who in the current day have sort of like a totalizing view of the world tend to be very frustrating to engage with. So like someone who actually takes on board the whole system of Proclus as like this is the thing that you should believe, this should be like the orthodoxy, and all pagans should agree on this as like the basis of our practices and our beliefs, not just as a matter of convenience, but as like, a matter of doctrine. I think that's very impoverished, or impoverishing compared to the approach of someone like Porphyry of Tyre, um, who was really like a polymath. So he has these works, and of course, as with most of these or a lot of these figures, we don't have most of what he wrote, but we have some texts by him that are very much in a Neoplatonic vein. But then we also have texts that are sort of written from a completely different perspective. So he has this work that's not entirely extant, but there's substantial fragments, which is called Periagalmaton, so on the cult statues or um, on statues, which gives more of a like vaguely stoic interpretation of the gods, um, or you could even say a non-sectarian uh, interpretation of the gods. So he says, for instance, um, that Hestia is a power of the earth, um, which you can take in sort of a vaguely Platonic sense. It's more straightforward to take it in a Stoic sense, but it can really be sort of acceptable to any pagan in a way. Um, and then he has like these commentaries on Homer, which are completely from sort of text immanent way. So he's completely staying on the level of mythology. So for the purposes of that work, the Cyclops or whatever is real, which in any other context he would, not accept for a second that there is such a thing as a Cyclops or as a centaur. But in that work, he just stays within the realm of myth, because that's sort of the language that Homer uses. Um, yeah, okay. Maybe I won't summarize all of his works, but that's just sort of a few things that he does, which are all quite different.
So there's like a depth to this person's writing that kind of belies some of these other folks who are like really like this is the narrow focus I've got, or at least that's the fragments we've got of their work.
Yeah, I wouldn't say necessarily depth, because I would say diversity.
Mm.
So Porphyry, when he's writing as a grammarian or as a philologist, he's writing as a philologist, and then when he's writing as a philosopher, he's writing as a philosopher. And I think, in a way, from Iamblichus onwards, and especially in Proclus, um, and maybe we should circle back to this and give like a historical sketch of who these people are. But um, there's, I think, kind of a reaction against this sort of diverse approach and more of an attempt to unify all of these ways of thinking, which has its advantages if you're purely prioritizing philosophy, but it does end up subordinating other ways of thinking to philosophy. And often when we look back on the history of ideas, intellectual history, we do see philosophy as like the most important thing. But I don't think that that was necessarily the perspective that non-philosophers had at the time. Um, there's this definition of philosophy as the knowledge of things human and divine, and that gets appropriated by a lot of other fields. So jurists will also say that actually jurisprudence is the knowledge of things human and divine, and I think Cicero maybe says that rhetoric is that, and so they all thought that their field was kind of the most important thing.
It's like how teachers in schools always think that their subject's the best, and how dare you be
Exactly.
late to their lesson, go be late to everyone else's lesson instead. Yeah. Yeah, I suppose it's interesting, and kind of in the sort of the modern day lay pagan's mind, Platonism is kind of the big philosophical school of the ancient world, and everything else is kind of a footnote, and they kind of have this idea of a lot of ancient Greeks and ancient Romans sitting around doing Platonic studies and living platonically without thought to anyone following other philosophical schools or being engaged with other philosophical traditions, or just the fact that it's kind of impossible for the entire world to be an academic.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's partly an effect of, well, one thing we should say is that this the sort of prominence of Neoplatonism in paganism as it exists right now on the internet is only possible because a huge amount of texts have been translated very recently. So over the last 20, 30 years, all of these texts, mostly commentaries on Plato and other philosophers, that had just never been translated into any other language, or maybe just Latin in the Renaissance, if that, suddenly became available in English and some other modern languages. And well, for the reasons that I said before, that they're very nuanced about religious issues. They're very attractive to pagans who sort of expect, coming from Christianity or Islam or whatever, who expect there to be like a very developed theology, like a consistent sort of metaphysics, thinking about the gods. Sort of see this as like the natural way a religion should express itself and should be articulated. And if you go back further, that's not really quite what other philosophical schools did. So the Stoics, for instance, they sort of take a much more symbolic approach. So on like a Stoic theory, when you're worshipping a particular god, it's not really that there is necessarily that god as a distinct sort of being out in the world. Maybe, but not necessarily. It's more that all of the ritual sort of has symbolic meaning about the nature of the world. So a sacrifice to Heracles doesn't, necessarily reach a person that is sort of individuated as Heracles. And it's more about handing down a certain vision of ethics and physics. And some of these theories that the Stoics had are pretty idiosyncratic, but also so are a lot of the Platonic ideas. But because of the influence that Platonism has had on Christianity and other religions, they maybe seem less idiosyncratic. They seem more sort of inherent to religion in the way that really they're not. And yeah, I don't know if that drifted away from the question, maybe, but all right.
No, you're good. So I suppose then, just kind of when we think about the history of philosophy, and you kind of touched on the fact that all these different schools, Platonism and Stoicism and Epicureanism and Cynicism and all these others, kind of there was a lot of back and forth between them. Ideas have very much occurred as sort of a dialogue between different schools and teachers through different periods of history. Why do you think Platonism seems to have had the sort of big impact that it seems to have done? And how would you try and explain Platonism's influence on things after the ancient world?
Um, that's I think I can answer that, but it's going to be a long answer. So
Awesome.
when we go back very far to the so-called pre-Socratic period, you have all of these individual philosophers who have their ideas, um, and you don't really have schools yet. So a new philosopher will come up and have their own ideas and write their own things. And then sort of, I mean, this is already simplifying things, but um, sort of in the wake of Socrates, you get a lot more of these schools. So Plato, Aristotle, and other figures um, who sort of start off these discursive traditions. So it's not necessarily at that point that they treat the works of their school's founder as sort of like a text to be expounded and sort of taken as doctrinally normative. But they do sort of take their lead from their founder, and then they sort of develop that way of thinking. They have their different sort of research programs, I suppose you could say. But then in the Roman period, there's sort of a what has been called a philological turn. So instead of sort of continuing to develop new ideas based on the work of their predecessors, philosophers started to turn back to their school's founders. And this meant, among other things, a return to Plato's teachings as something that was worth reconstructing systematically. Whereas previously, Plato's Academy had sort of developed into a skeptical school that didn't, have a theory of forms or a specific doctrine on the elements, but was rather, skeptical about all of these things, about the ability of humans to reach certain knowledge. And this also seems to have meant, or seems to have resulted in less of a historical approach to philosophy, in the sense that from that period we don't have a lot of writing about the history of philosophy. So who taught whom? It becomes more important whose school someone belongs to, and they're most interested in the school's founders, like Plato, like Aristotle. And then in the third century, what were formerly the most prominent schools, so Epicureanism and Stoicism, seem to have, for whatever reason, become less popular, which is, I suppose, more of a loss in the case of Epicureanism, because it had penetrated sort of the general culture less. So with the loss of Epicurean texts, those ideas fell away in a way that Stoic ideas didn't, because like all of Roman period writing is sort of permeated by the Stoic view of the cosmos, and that is also sort of taken for granted in a lot of ways by the Neoplatonists. And as these other schools sort of fall out of historical view for reasons that can't really be explained by us now, because we just don't have the sources for that, the Neoplatonists developed a sense of history again, I would say. So they developed a sense that they had sort of a new founder, Plotinus, who had made advancements over his predecessors and whose work had to be built on. And it was important to sort of point out your lineage. And that's why we have that's why we know who was whose teacher and then who was their teacher and so on with the Neoplatonists, in a way that for the 2 or 3 centuries before that, we really don't. We have like, okay, this was the teacher, but then we don't know who their teacher was. And this was, I suppose, really the innovation of Neoplatonism, that they made it important again that there was like a school that developed both from the original work of Plato, but then also built one on top of the other and kept sort of going back to all of those in-between sources. Um, and because that happened after all of the other schools, and because just out of historical accident, that meant that the Neoplatonists got to pick which philosophical texts got transmitted further down the line. That meant that Neoplatonic texts ended up surviving in much greater volume, and also their sources. So Plato and Aristotle survived in much more complete form than any other philosopher prior to Plotinus. Yeah, I'm afraid I've gotten into even more detail than I meant to, but
No, you're good. It's really interesting. I can see Sarenth itching to ask about the relevancy and application of a lot of this. So just to squeeze in before he does,
You really
there
know
is
me.
one big Oh yeah, there is one big misconception I see a lot about Platonism. So just while we're specifically in the weeds of Platonism, I just want to ask your thoughts on this idea that I see bandied around pagan communities a lot, which is this idea that Platonism is quote unquote proto-monotheism, or Platonism is just monotheism in disguise. Um, how do you view and respond to that?
that is a very widespread conception, and it goes back to ancient monotheists who wanted to appropriate Plato. And they sort of had a certain precedent in the way, terminologically at least, in the way that Plato was interpreted by Platonists in antiquity, um, which is that above all in Stoicism, but sort of more broadly, the god, so ho theos in Greek, became like a technical term for like the highest deity or the sort of first principle of a philosophical system. And this is sort of like fundamental to Stoicism. It just posits that basically everything is or is governed by the god, who is most commonly called Zeus. It's not really there in Plato yet, but you have certain passages that you can sort of, once you have this concept, you can sort of start finding it in Plato as well. For instance, in the Timaeus, where he talks about the demiurge, and he never names the demiurge. And the reason is that he doesn't, he just doesn't identify the demiurge. He just gives him a functional name. So demiurge means craftsman or creator. So the whoever created the universe, the cosmos, that's the demiurge, and we don't know his name, or at least Plato doesn't want to sort of commit to a specific name. So he just calls him the demiurge or the god. But if you are familiar with the god as like a technical term, then you start thinking, oh, he's calling the god the demiurge. And so before Plotinus, a lot of Platonists were calling or were taking Plato to say that one of the sort of principles of his system was a being called the god. And depending on the system, they might also identify it as the intellect or the one or whatever else. This actually becomes less common with Plotinus, who does sometimes call his first principle the one, the god, but he doesn't seem to be using it as like a technical term. He calls sort of a lot of different principles the god, and it seems to be, the same way that you would both call Zeus and Hephaestus the god, because they're both gods. But Christians, were also using ho theos, and so were Jews, to mean, one specific god who they thought was the only god. And so they could sort of more or less disingenuously. It depends on who you're talking about. I think some believe this very, very genuinely, and some were using it cynically. They could sort of present Plato and other philosophers as effectively agreeing with them, even though, in substance, they clearly didn't. But you could sort of pick out these individual passages that sound the same as something a monotheist might say. And this is, attractive to monotheists who want to use Plato, and a lot of monotheists have used Plato. And it's also attractive to anyone who has sort of a progressive view of, or evolutionary view, I should say, of cultural history. So anyone, and this includes a lot of atheists who thinks, we start with polytheism and then we go to monotheism and then we get to atheism. They also like this idea that intellectuals start being monotheists, and then wider culture becomes monotheistic, and then intellectuals start being atheists, and then everyone becomes an atheist. The sort of idea of progression. And yeah, even some pagans now, because of this association of monotheism with a more intellectual or more enlightened view of the world, are attracted to this idea that they're not doing sort of, I guess, vulgar paganism. They're doing something, um, yeah, more sophisticated. Uh, and in my opinion, you can be very sophisticated as a monotheist, and you can be very vulgar as a monotheist, and it's sort of the same thing with polytheism and atheism and all kinds of views. So yeah.
I think for me the thing where I come down to is um, the great chain idea, or the similar notions of, oh, there's this curve of evolution that's inherent in religion and philosophy, is kind of a goofy notion, especially because you can go back and forth um, on so many different spectrums of knowledge or ideas, things like that. It never made a lot of sense to me, and it just seemed like pleading special cases to put your little philosophy or religion on top of that particular pyramid, wherever it happened to be, whether it was Christianity or atheism. Um, so I guess the because you can see how this idea kind of flows into later Enlightenment thinking. You can see how when some of these folks are reaching back, that there's a kind of a misunderstanding in some of the later writings, where they're like, "Oh yeah, see, this ancient philosopher agrees with me, so we're gonna kick off this new philosophy, which is reaching back to all these old ideas, because obviously they agree with us, especially in the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment periods." Um, I don't know. I can see that, like, the great chain of being, or whatever the popular term for it at the time. I can definitely see how this kind of feeds back into some of these more antiquarian ideas around, well, these are just how things go. Um, I guess my question to that end is, where do you see as the major places where these things, where ancient and modern religion intersect, not only from this intellectual discourse that's been taking place over literally thousands of years, but I mean, Sartrix is a really big undertaking in general, from this
Because
position.
um, so when you say modern religion and ancient religion, what are we talking about in terms of modern religion? Do you mean
So, so my perspective is like, for us as pagans, as polytheists, animists, etc., like, um, beyond, of course, just taking these words and ideas out of their historical context, and trying to understand them with our more modern methods and ways of means, where do you see a lot of the intersection between, um, digging into these ancient ideas informing our modern religions, because there's some of these ideas you can clearly trace, like we've mentioned several times already with Platonism and Neoplatonism, where they have a lot of play in pagan spaces. Um, are there ideas and notions in these philosophies or in these translations as over time as you've looked at them, um, where you might be actually seeing more of these intersections than just the really obvious stuff of, well, Platonism is a really popular philosophy because it's coherent and it has a depth to it and a richness. Are there other places where we're starting to see more intersections, or perhaps where there's more of an appreciation of the ancient in the modern?
Um, that is such a
I know it's such a broad
such an
question.
open-ended question that I'm struggling to think where to start. So, hmm, I think so. Okay, let me
Yeah,
tackle
we,
this
we
from
can
a
yeah we can drill down a little bit.
place that that's not at all what you asked, but
That's okay.
um, so a lot of discussion in pagan spaces is about sort of this question of how faithful you have to be to ancient sources, or how
Mhm.
faithful you should be. Um, and a lot of it is sort of this imagined distinction between, people who reconstruct historical practices and people who just, I suppose, take sort of general ideas and then uh, take them up in a modern way that feels right to them.
Mhm.
And that is, I think, um, a way of presenting oneself rather than sort of a factual distinction, in the sense that a lot of people think they're doing things according to like a historical standard that is really just as freely interpreted as anything a self-confessed or self-identified revivalist would do. And it's really more about sort of how you think about yourself. Like, do you consider yourself someone who is doing something as they did it historically, or do you think you're doing something more independent? And I think a sort of a more mature way of dealing with ancient sources would be to say, whatever we do with these sources, we don't have something like a whole canon of church law, or hundreds of books about Sharia, or the Talmud with dozens of commentaries. We have very partial, and this goes for any ancient pagan culture. We have very partial, incomplete, fractured um, sources. But on the other hand, for a lot of these cultures, we also have extremely rich sources, so much more than an individual intellectual at the time might have had access to. So we can't sort of imitate mm, any model exactly, but we actually do learn an enormous amount from the sources that are extant. And I think a lot of a lot of conflict arises just out of sort of insecurities about um, what we would like to imagine that we're doing and what we are afraid we might actually be doing. And for all sort of the things that are not to be imitated from ancient sources, one thing that I think we should sort of imitate is that they're not worried about these things. They're not super worried about like what exactly is the ancestral way, and that's not just because they got taught by their parents and so they just knew it, instinctively or whatever. It's also because it hadn't been articulated as like a specific, super consistent thing that you have to follow exactly. Um, they were um, they were all improvising as we are. And so I think what non-Neoplatonic texts are maybe sometimes better at teaching us is sort of a pluralism, an openness and to ambiguity, um, an acceptance of what we can't know, what we don't know, and a willingness to sort of guess and improvise. One author that I really love, who is very far from a Neoplatonist, is Servius, a commentator on Virgil. And I think the modern philological approach to an ancient text is sort of to find out what does it really mean. And I think that also tends to be the approach in biblical exegesis among Christians. But actually, I'm not so sure about Jewish Bible exegesis, but definitely in Islamic exegesis of the Quran, that's not really the approach. So most tafsir, so Quran commentary literature, sort of almost celebrates the fact that you can interpret the same verse in a lot of ways. And Servius sometimes will just give one interpretation of something, but there also seems to be sort of a joy in the different ways you can take something. And sometimes it is more of a, well, we don't know which thing Virgil intended, but at other times it's clearly these different ways of interpreting the same thing with the assumption that the poet probably meant both, and it doesn't have a specific individual meaning. So you can take something that's said about Jupiter in a mythical sense, you can take it in a physical sense, you can take it in an astrological sense, and these things are not, the remit of just rivaling sects or something. It's not like astrologers believe one thing about Jupiter and they oppose the mythical tradition or something. The mythical tradition exists whether or to whatever extent you believe in it. And for the most part, ancient writers are not very bothered about the fact that most myths seem to be not true. Sometimes they get into it, but a lot of times they don't. And they're also not bothered about, let's say, the boundaries of religious traditions, in a way that a lot of people now are very anxious about being a Celtic polytheist or a Gaulish polytheist or a Germanic or, these sometimes very hyper-specific identities, which, a Roman, an ordinary Roman might have gone to the temple of Isis or the temple of Serapis on the same day that he went to the temple of Mercury. The temple of Apollo was originally, imported from Greece. Asclepius, the Mater Magna, was from Celtic parts of Asia Minor. All of these things. Yeah. Again, I think I've drifted away from the question.
I actually don't. I don't because the thing that I really wanted to kind of like this is actually kind of where I was hoping some of this wandering would go, because one of the things that gets when you get down into the weeds and some of the mythology and the folklore and the particulars of your whatever niche you're looking at, being a heathen, a lot of specifically mostly a Nordic and Icelandic source for my practice, one of the things that really bothers some people that I've learned to have to just kind of go, we just don't know, is you realize how much of the fucking map is missing if you look at your sources long enough.
Yeah.
And how fragmented it really is in terms of time and space. For instance, did they worship the Alfar in this way? We have no fucking idea.
Yeah.
If we're intellectually honest with each other, We don't know is probably the best answer we can give on a lot of these questions. But here's what I'm going to do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think like the Snorri Edda has like maybe a handful of references to worship, like why
Right.
someone would actually worship a god. And it's like clearly the idea is that gods are worshipped, um, but the um, but we just don't know a lot of how and why
Right.
specifically.
Well, I mean, when you kind of pull the lens back and you realize how many hundreds of years of history they're probably talking about in this little compressed volume. I mean, and then you take this idea to almost any historical source where it's like, oh, well, this is how the Romans used to do it. What era? What
Oh
time range
yeah,
are we talking about? What culture
absolutely.
intersections? Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. Like with Roman, like if you Google like I don't know, household worship Roman or
Right.
whatever, you will always see, you need a lararium, which is an extremely rare word that is mostly found in one work, where it seems to describe like little temples that you have in your house that aren't said to have Lars in them. So already kind of confusing. Um, and then how that actually gets filled in is, or rather, where that information comes from is Pompeii. And there you have these painted or 3D sculptural temples that were in houses or around houses, that a lot of times did have lares as figurines or paintings in them. And so, because of that, scholars called them lararia. But we don't know if people in Pompeii actually called them that. And we don't know how typical the Pompeian lararia were of the Roman world more generally, if they were like that in earlier times, if they were like that in later times. Um, and I mean, I'm sure there's more knowledge about it out there than I have because it's not that easy to dig up, and I'm not really big into archaeology. Um, but yeah, so the way that Roman worship gets sort of represented among a lot of pagans today is based on one city in one decade. And then the idea is all Romans or everyone in the Roman Empire used these lararia, and then Greeks did something else. But if you
When you're talking about these sources, I mean, oftentimes it's some rich fucker who's got the time to write this stuff down, and it might be
absolutely.
so hyper niche, it might just be his neighbors.
Yes, yes.
Like,
And
congrats, you're imitating Pompey's neighbor who happened to be like loaded.
exactly. Yeah, it's kind of surprising how little ancient sources actually discuss household temples. Um, I guess
Right?
because they were like so just part
Why
of
would you write
normal
about it?
life. Um, but
Yeah.
yeah, the way I tend to think about it is that, we know enough from like Egypt and Greece and Rome to
Mhm.
think that, there were similar practices around these household temples. And it doesn't make a lot of sense to have like well, this is a lorarium because it's Roman, and this is a naiscos because it's Greek, and then a different word for the Egyptian. Like, of course, sort of as a tendency, those would be different. Like in Rome, in Athens, in southern Egypt,
Mhm.
the typical household altar would be different. But it's not like there were these separate practices with all different terminology. Like
Right.
if a Roman and a Greek and an Egyptian were all talking in Greek, they would all be using the same words, and they might have some of the same statues. And if they're living in the same place, they're probably their temples in their houses would probably look the same. Um, yeah.
No, I appreciate you digging into that. That's actually where kind of somewhere where I was hoping that you'd hit, because like so much of this is culture dependent, culture of the moment, not necessarily these atomized cultures that we look back on with this romantic view of like, wow, they were like all in on this one form of worship. And it's like, dude, this
Yeah.
is like one guy at one decade in one particular town. Like,
Yeah.
calm down. It's okay to be eclectic. Most of these guys were too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of, I mean, one tendency that sort of comes out of 19th century nationalism is this idea that, you have this like essential Romanness and essential Greekness. And then one way of sort of countering that is to sort of get hyper local and to try to reconstruct like um, purely Athenian or purely, I don't know, Corinthian, Spartan. Um, and that just that I think, I mean, I have a lot of respect for people who do the research to do that. But I think as like a vision for what you should do, it's kind of a dead end because our sources will say like, okay, this is like a Spartan version of the story. This is like a whatever, an Athenian version. But that doesn't mean that all Spartans believe that Spartan version and all Athenians believe that Athenian version. It's that there's like one Spartan author who gave that version and one Athenian author who gave that version. And then everyone read the text that said, oh, here is an Athenian, here is a Spartan version. And a lot of paganism was very trans-regional. Or on the other hand, like super individual, where, it's not the city was the same. It depended on the family. A lot of things in Rome, which is just a place that's very well documented, so we know this. A lot of rituals or festivals were specific to particular prominent families, and other families would not celebrate the same things, and might not even have the same gods. Um, and you got to imagine that those traditions were not actually stable across centuries, but a lot of things would have been invented traditions where someone sort of looked back and a lot of in a very similar way to how we do. They're sort of looking at something from history and saying, okay, we're going to do that again, um, and sort of acting as if they had always been doing it. Um,
I
but
mean,
yeah.
in a manner of speaking, that's kind of what you were talking about the Neoplatonists doing. Kind of like this backward look, and then, oh yeah, these writings are now important to us, and these are the carriers of the tradition.
Yeah, yeah,
Everything that's old is new again.
absolutely. And I mean that's how tradition works. There's this um like the way that like tradcasts approach tradition is like there is the tradition. You have how it's done, and it's always been done this way. And then there's how tradition actually works, which is you sort of get something handed down, and then you sort of pick and choose what you think makes sense out of the whole body of what you've been given, and you sort of hand down more things, you add to it.
Meanwhile, the folk Catholics are looking around like, I'm gonna go bury Saint Joe for this, that, and the other. And when I get
Yeah.
my way, I can unbury him. And meanwhile, the Trad Cat's going, "You're what?"
Well, I believe that's fine if you're not doing it with idolatrous intent.
Right.
Just whatever that means. Um,
Oh goodness.
So on the point of 19th century romantic writers and tradition and transmission, who's Thomas Taylor for those
very
who
good,
don't know?
very good. Thomas Taylor is he was called the British pagan. Um, I think he might have been. Well, there's always undocumented things, but I think the first well-known case of someone openly uh, and sort of unabashedly calling themselves a pagan, um, sort of in a post-Christian context rather than a context where paganism was still existing. So he was like actually I'm not super firm on his biography, but I think he was kind of an autodidact and not a philologist per se, which shows itself, or yeah, shows itself in the way that he typeset his Greek, which is that he omitted accents, which sort of um, virtually every Greek word in ancient Greek has at least one and often multiple accents, and he apparently learned Greek just from, I think, mostly reading books and didn't learn the accents, I guess. And when he would print his books, he would give quotations of Greek without the accents, and this was one reason that quote unquote actual scholars would not take him very seriously or would sort of ridicule him. But he was very convinced that he had sort of found the truth that had eluded everyone else, because he, I guess, somehow stumbled upon the Neoplatonists at a time where a lot of their texts had not been published at all, and they were not very widely read. But there were some editions, and I'm not sure if he consulted any texts in manuscript, but he definitely did like a lot of pretty heroic work, I would say, in the sense that he was finding these very rare editions of Greek texts, um, which had a lot of words that were not in any dictionary, and which there were no pre-existing translations or commentaries on or anything. And he translated like these really, really long books, for not a lot of money, but it was his passion. And he openly advocated not just for the importance of these pagan philosophers, but for their being correct about the existence of gods and these kinds of things, which around 1800, pretty remarkable independence of spirit. um not that I would like unreservedly admire him in all respects. He was very conservative in a way that unfortunately a lot of Platonists today also are. But yeah, I just think his work as someone who was not at the sort of in the academy um, was very remarkable, and uh, I kind of see him as a model for what I do. Not being at a university myself and just sort of doing this work at my own uh, expense, I suppose, mostly.
Because I know mention of Thomas Taylor is kind of littered across your website and your old blog site. And I know myself, and for a lot of people, the first time you encounter Thomas Taylor is when you end up trying to find a sort of ancient Greek Platonic texts online. Often the free editions translated into English are the Thomas Taylor 19th century translations that you can find sort of free and readily
Yeah.
available online.
I think.
Um,
No, no,
so, oh,
you go
sorry.
ahead.
So I was going to say, I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate on the significance of Thomas Taylor's influence on Sartrix.
So, well, the Sartrix is the sort of the Latin for a female tailor. So, uh, I was just sort of, I suppose, fishing around for a name that would be relatively unique, and it just occurred to me that, well, I'm kind of doing the same thing that Thomas Taylor was doing, so let me just use that name basically. And I think in some respects I have particular sympathy for him, um, because he, even though he is like used very widely by pagans now, because for the reasons you said, that his translations are long out of copyright, so they're readily available, where a lot of these texts are very expensive to buy in modern translations. Um, but because he's so old and also sort of affected kind of an archaic style, he is also quite alienating to modern readers. And I always feel kind of defensive of him. Um, just the way that I learned English, I read a lot of old stuff very early on. So for me, um, in a way that's not true of German, my native language, but in English, it doesn't make that much of a difference to me whether something's in like contemporary English or 19th century English. Um, and so I always feel that he's like a little bit cheated unfairly for being like hard to understand. And that was just what English was like at the time. Like it's not because he's doing the language wrong, you know. I mean, that's kind of obvious, but um, a specific thing that he sort of gets faulted for is that his translation of the Orphic hymns, which I think he might have actually thought were written by Orpheus himself, but we know now that they were probably written in the second century, and they're the most comprehensive collection of hymns from classical paganism. Um, what was I saying? His translation of them is into rhyming couplets into sort of the poetic English of the time, which is very different from how sort of from current poetic style. And also something that people don't like is that he uses the Latin names for the gods. Um, and that is like a pet peeve of mine that people get very upset, and this is true of classical scholars as well as pagans, when you mix up Zeus and Jupiter, even though everyone in antiquity did that. Nobody in antiquity ever said that Zeus and Jupiter were not the same. Um, but Thomas Taylor gets criticized for translating Zeus as Jupiter, um, even though at the time they were simply not using the Greek names of the gods. So it was just translating it into English, and the English names for the gods at the time were the Latin ones. Um, so, for these sort of petty reasons, I always sort of feel a little bit on his side. And I think I do have, unfortunately, kind of a contrarian streak, um, where I sort of double down on these things, these small things that I think other people get wrong. It's not an admirable trait, but it is one reason that I like Thomas Taylor.
No, it's interesting hearing you comment about that because I know myself whenever I've quoted something from his writings or his translations or linked to them or something, I have very often found that I get the response of this stuff, this Platonism is inaccessible and impenetrable enough as it is without it being in very flowery, archaic English that's very inaccessible and difficult on top of that. It's like you're adding complication upon complication. And so it's sort of interesting hearing you comment about that, especially as someone who, as you said, the English isn't your native language.
He sounds like a skill issue.
I mean, yeah, to an extent. Like if you read something from 1800s, you just have to look up words in a dictionary that's from the time. Um, that's just how that works. You can't get there by effort. You can't just think really hard about what it means and then you'll understand it. It is just like a different language, basically. Um, and yeah, I would also say that um, if you don't want to read very inaccessible things, there are a lot of more accessible things than reading Platonism. And there is so much pagan literature, so much poetry, um, and going back to something I said earlier, where we sort of, because of Christianity, think that the primary way religion has to be articulated is like as theology or the kind of thing you would put in a sermon. Um, I think a lot of people sort of gravitate towards something like Platonism, even if it's maybe not very congenial to what they actually need or want. Um, and poetry, because it's not sort of this hyper rational thing, and it it doesn't actually have to be understood necessarily in order to be appreciated. I think is something maybe that should be more present in paganism, not for its truth content, for like what it teaches us about what the gods are actually like, but just as um, something beautiful that paganism has given us, historical paganism.
Hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense.
I really like, no, yeah, I really like that and think that that would be worth considering for a lot of people, really, that a lot of these things can be impactful and beautiful without feeling the need to understand every granular
Yeah.
detail of it all.
Like sorry.
Because I think, um, no, I was going to say because I just think a lot of people get hung up on that.
Yeah. Like one example I think would be a lot of people don't like Ovid because his myths, which they're not really his myths. Like he probably gives his spin on and things, but even myths that you can't find anywhere else, he didn't just make up out of whole cloth. But a lot of people don't like Ovid because the gods come off very badly in some of the stories. They come off very, very well in other
Mhm.
stories, but like that's kind of the point. They're not teaching you, like they're um not to say that the Bible is even like this, but like the way that Bible stories get told, where they have like a clear, sort of very straightforward moral or ethical or theological lesson. That's not what, say, I mean, a lot of myths are about sexual violence, right? Or other kinds of violence. And that's not because they're saying like sexual violence is good. They're meant to be shocking, and they're not necessarily meant to have like a resolution to that shock. They're not necessarily giving you a way out of that discomfort. But that's part of what makes them so powerful, is that you can't rationalize them entirely. Like you can sort of spin them into different interpretations, but at the end of the day, it's still like a really overpowering image in a lot of ways, in a lot of instances. And even once you've, I suppose, decoded it, you still go back to the image and you look at you consider the imagery, the metaphors, the symbolism, without necessarily being able to reduce it to a particular intellectual message.
So I suppose one question that I've got is throughout this, we're kind of talking about antique periods and late antique periods and things of that nature. When you say late antique, when exactly do you
So I
mean?
think, well, this is actually a very controversial thing, but um,
Mm.
for a specific reason that I will unpack more momentarily. But like the core period, I guess, would be like the third or maybe later third to the sixth century. And then, well, I think you could say that late antiquity has sort of gradually ballooned. Um, and the fourth century used to be considered as, no longer really antiquity, but that was like Byzantium. Um, so Byzantinists would study Julian, the Emperor Julian. But then late antiquity sort of emerged as its own sort of subdiscipline, and gradually got longer and longer. And now people are sort of taking not only the rise of Islam, but also the classical period of Islam, so ninth, 10th century, as sort of either being part of late antiquity or being an extension of late antiquity. Um, so it really depends sort of on how you look at things, or what your interest in it is. But when you're talking about paganism, um, it is, I guess, sort of the period, or I should say, when you're talking about philosophy, it's really the period of Neoplatonism. So the third century to sort of the sixth century is when you have Neoplatonism in like a narrow sense, and then it sort of gets adopted in various different ways by Christians and Jews and Muslims. Um, and For paganism, it's sort of less precise, but sort of a similar period, third to sixth, seventh, eighth century, and sort of the last known classical pagans um, would have been in the 10th century in what's now, well, Turkey or Syria.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with Earl Fontenelle's podcast, The Secret History of Western
Yes,
Esotericism.
I've been on an episode
Oh, yes, of
talking
course.
about Martiana's Capella.
Yes. Yes. Um, because I know he did an episode where he was talking about the notion of what exactly is medieval and how we define medieval and how we talk about these kind of different eras of history. And was saying that in a lot of ways, when people look at philosophy, they kind of go, well, there was this glorious golden ancient period, and then nothing happened for a few hundred years in this period we'll
Yeah.
call medieval. And then we get the modern era, beginning with the Renaissance, when everyone rediscovered all the stuff from the beautiful ancient period. Which kind of gets brought into question with what you were saying about this kind of ballooning and stretching of this late ancient, late antique period.
Yeah. I think late antiquity was sort of what is now called late antiquity was sort of even more ignored than the medieval period because it sort of conceptually didn't really exist. It was like no longer classical and not yet medieval. Um, but Yeah, I mean the same way as medieval sort of becomes, well, it is a very sort of Eurocentric term, right? So the further
Mm.
east or south you apply it, the less sense it really makes. And with late antiquity, there's sort of a similar problem where um, there are sort of reasons to use it, like in the history of philosophy, it's just sort of maps perfectly onto Neoplatonism, so that's a reason to use it. When you're talking about the Roman Empire, it's sort of the period in which the empire shrank and became divided into multiple realms. But then, yeah, as I said, it gets extended further and further because in the Near East, in Syria, Iraq, there's not really a dramatic break in the way that there was in Western Europe, and likewise in like the Eastern Mediterranean more generally. The Roman Empire sort of gets rechristened as Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, by historians retrospectively, but it really continued to exist in Asia Minor and Greece until basically for another 1,000 years. And so yeah, I'm personally not a big fan of the term late antiquity, but it is sort of the convenient term for certain reasons. And
Hmm.
for the moment, I'm willing to use it.
So I suppose on the kind of topic of debating terminology, where do you stand on using the term Neoplatonism as opposed to late
Well, I
Platonism?
was just working on a paper about this actually.
Oh,
You damn bomb thrower.
I think Neoplatonism is the best term we have because late Platonism, okay, taking a step back. So Neoplatonism is a specific school of Platonic thought that gets started with Plotinus in the late third century and it continues to the sixth century. But people who were not part of this tradition were also reading Plato at the same time. And some of them were, not just lay people, they were also philosophers, but not Neoplatonists. So when you say late Platonism and you mean the Neoplatonists, you're sort of either pretending that those other people didn't exist, or you're pretending that their differences don't matter. But if you're sort of being that broad, I'm not sure why you would even specify late Platonism to begin with, the thing about the Neoplatonists is that they have like a very elaborate system of terminology, and they build on each other, and they have like very peculiar ideas that other Platonists didn't share. Um, so the usefulness of the term lies in its specificity. Um, and yeah, if you say in late Platonism, you should be including these other people that didn't have the same views. And then it just becomes a less useful term, a less precise term. And I think the idea is that Neoplatonism is used as like, okay, there's Platonism, which is the real thing, and then there's Neoplatonism, which is like fake. But I've never actually seen that usage anywhere. It seems to be like purely what people take from it, even though it's not intended that way. And, in a lot of contexts, neo just means the last stage of something or a late stage of something. Like the last stage of the Sumerian language is called Neo-Sumerian. That's not because it's not Sumerian or because it's like fake Sumerian. And yeah.
Oh, because Sumerian stopped. Now there's the new
Exactly. It's not like New Coke. Wait, was it New Coke? Or whatever. I might get that reference wrong. It's like just something I picked up via pop culture because it wasn't a thing in Germany.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I know I'd sort of adopted the idea of kind of there's a continuum of Platonism, and so specifying early, middle, or late is merely a matter of pointing out when on the chronology, when on the sort of historical timeline we're talking. And I'd kind of adopted this criticism that Neoplatonism implied it was a new Platonism with something of some degree of a break from early and the very forgotten and overlooked Middle Platonism. And now all of a sudden here were Plotinus, Porphyry, and Iamblichus with these crazy radical ideas.
Well, but they were radical, and they knew that. So in Porphyry's Life of Plotinus, he says that some people accuse Plotinus of just sort of having the same interpretation of Plato as what's his name? Numenius. And Porphyry, I think, wrote a defense, or maybe it was someone else, but there was like one of his students wrote a defense of Plotinus, like showing, no, this is actually where he differs from from Numenius. And that was not because the idea was Numenius was an innovator and Plotinus agreed with all of the earlier exegetes. Like they knew very well, and in Proclus you have these sort of historical overviews of like all of the different Platonic interpretations, and then Plotinus is better than all the ones before, but then Porphyry is a little better than him, and Iamblichus is better than him, and so they did not at all have this idea that all Platonists just have the doctrine of Plato. They knew that Plotinus was an innovator. They knew that they were innovating on Plotinus. They just thought that sort of by this process, they were getting a better and better understanding of Plato's original meaning. And there is also, well, you said early, middle, and Neoplatonism, but actually there's not really an early Platonism because that is called the Academy. And there was like a shift of terminology where up to a certain point they called themselves academics. And then there was like a well, I mentioned this before, it's sort of the philological turn to being specifically followers of Plato and exegetes of Plato rather than sort of continuers of his project in the academy. So I'm not quite sure when it starts, but from a certain point on, they no longer call themselves akademikoi, they call themselves platonikoi. And so, in a sense, using the word Platonism for anything before the so-called Middle Platonists is wrong. They were academics. And Plato himself was obviously not a Platonist. He was just Plato. So there is...
In the same way that Jesus wasn't a
Exactly.
Christian.
And so there's not really like an original Platonism. There's Plato and there's the academy, and then there are the Platonists later on. And none of the Platonists ever thought, basically, that the academics had gotten Plato right. Each one of them was sort of trying to go back to Plato and figure out what he really meant. And they all had different interpretations. And then Plotinus came along, and his interpretation was sort of persuasive to more people and over a longer time than anyone else's. And that does represent like a real substantial difference compared to earlier Platonists and also to other contemporaries who didn't sort of follow the Platonian program, so to speak.
I hear all this and I'm just like, oh, so the Tumblr posts where we're debating each other on what the proper theology is, nothing is new under the sun. The TikToks back and forth about, well, I don't think you're practicing this philosophy correctly. Okay, so we're just human history. The only thing that we've really done is speed up the process. So we're no longer sending each other these little letters in Green Egg magazine. Now we're just instantaneously zapping each other with, well, I think you're full of shit. Instead of being in the forum, now we're just standing across the equivalent of a street corner and hollering at each other.
Yeah.
So I love it. I love it because like there's this goofy distance that gets put between us and the thousands of years that are between us and these people who were philosophizing or not philosophizing, depending on who you're asking at this point. Because they're doing it wrong. It just strikes me how funny it is. Not to like boil down all of human history to a series of conversations we've had literally thousands of times now, but so much of what you're talking about here just strikes me as so damn funny because these aren't settled topics, but we keep having this conversation round and round again.
Yeah.
Like the open question of like, what is a Platonist? It changes with generations, turns out.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that I find most interesting about Sartrix is that you're not trying to freeze this stuff in time. You're trying to not only give context, but effective dialoguing with history. And it's one of the things that I find the most interesting about your project and projects like yours, where whether it's a WordPress or a wiki or a ongoing blog or what have you, there's this dialogue with the past that goes through these certain channels. In your case, it's a very something you mentioned at the top of the show was that this is a form of devotion for you, and that is exactly what it strikes me as, is like an act of extreme devotion to not only intellectually present these ideas, but also please use these ideas. Here they are; they're accessible. That I think is also something that's very different from previous generations. Not only that we have people from inside the system doing this, but that we have so many people who are able to process and read it. I think if we have anything that really differs us from previous generations, it's how many of us can grok this information in a way that previous generations might not have been able to because the education wasn't there, the literacy wasn't there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One thing that I find really important is to not search for, or well, for me specifically, as like a scholar, to not search for how it really was, because a lot of scholarship is invested in sort of this what was Greek religion really like or originally like.
Mm.
Um, and so there's this sort of suspicion towards sources where you're not really taking them seriously as something a pagan wrote. You're just using it to find out about historical paganism. And when you're sort of stripping away every pagan writer's interpretation of paganism, you're left with very little of the actual paganism. Um, and sometimes just because that approach is sort of so dominant or especially in earlier stuff like Walter Burkhart's Greek religion is very much like this. Um, and just because of its prominence in scholarship, that is sort of also an approach that practicing pagans just absorb unconsciously, um, where they're sort of suspicious of interpretations, even ancient interpretations, that seem to get away from what they think would have been like the most authentic or most original view of a thing. So people will assume, for instance, that like the authentic belief of religious people is that there's an immortal soul that then goes to Hades or whatever. But a lot of people in antiquity just didn't think that the soul continued after death. And that's not a less authentic idea. It's just a different idea that was also current. And so I always strive to present these different things as a thing or as approaches that can be used that are still relevant. So it's not that Neoplatonism has made earlier ideas of Stoicism and so on redundant, and it's not that all of these philosophical interpretations are less authentic than a supposed original. It's that all of these different ideas should be taken seriously and not sort of just discarded as the the medium by which like the authentic religion has reached us.
Mm.
And so I always try to um, bring in like a range of ideas into an article about a deity, for example. I try to bring in um, different ideas, different genealogies, different philosophical interpretations, um, as something that is like just as actual or just as relevant to us now as any other idea. Um, yeah.
I do think I'm sort of appreciate you saying that and appreciate that you do that in your work, because I think it's important to consider that any group that you look at, regardless of time or location, you're going to find differences and you're going to find disagreements and you're going to find debates and discussion. Whether you look at the Platonists or the Neoplatonists or the Stoics, or you mentioned Marx earlier, and Marxists and socialists are famous for infighting.
Absolutely. Awkward people.
Oh,
But
yeah.
yeah, it's not a barrier to being in community. Or it doesn't have to be. It sometimes ends up being, but it doesn't have to be and it shouldn't. Yeah.
It needn't be. Because I think often a lot of times people kind of in very simple terms for the sake of brevity or word count or whatever will say, well, Platonists all thought
Right.
X. And you're always going to be able to find exceptions to that.
Yeah. And a lot of times the exceptions are the rule, so to speak. And what you think
Yeah.
is like the normative thing was actually quite idiosyncratic. And you're always
Right.
going to assume that the thing you like was secretly the thing that everyone actually thought, but that's probably not true, you know.
Yeah. I agree with this, so therefore everyone else at the time probably did as
Yeah,
well. It just happened that this loud vocal minority gets assumed to
exactly.
be
Yeah.
representative. Yeah.
I mean, congratulations, you just solved all of academia.
I also appreciate as well that you talk so much about how authorship can be debated and questioned, because a lot of the time, especially with things like the Norse having an oral tradition, and other parts of the world as well have oral traditions, things aren't written down, or things weren't written down for centuries and whatnot. And so you often see modern day pagans get very dismissive of these things and say, oh, well, these things were lost. If only they'd been preserved exactly and engraved, like the Greek stuff and the Roman stuff and the Egyptian stuff, because that stuff is pristine and we know it word for word. We have every single thing all those people ever thought because they wrote it down. Whereas all the oral culture has all been lost. And you're kind of loudly proclaiming, well, no, actually, stuff being written down doesn't make it any more solid and beyond doubt than oral
absolutely.
things.
Yeah, I think there's like sometimes there's like just such a gap between what someone in a field thinks and what people outside that field think. And when you study any kind of philology, any sort of like literary studies, um, you're aware of how fragile a text is, and at the same time, you become very relaxed about that fact. Um, because if you try to copy just one page of a text, you're going to make mistakes. That's basically unavoidable. And as a trained copyist, you would make fewer mistakes. And if you have the time and the money, you can check and correct mistakes. But especially a text that gets copied many times over the centuries does just naturally have a lot of mistakes, gaps, and so on. But that's normal. That's how texts work. So it's not. It doesn't faze me. It doesn't worry me. And oral tradition obviously functions. If it's purely oral, it obviously functions very differently from a purely written tradition. Although there are also like a lot of cultures where oral and written texts are sort of less split up than we would imagine. But yeah, I'm also not very worried about the supposed interference of Christianity, and like it seems to me like in basically a pagan tradition, if you're sort of innovating within that tradition, that's still part of the tradition, even if like the specific poet is a Christian. Like that does not make the particular way he tells those stories inauthentic. It's not as if there was like an authentic core or original version, and then he took that original version and put it like through a Christian filter. That's not how these sort of things work. And yeah, as you say, also in like other contexts, folk traditions, um, they shouldn't be measured against this idea of there having originally been like one true way that they were authentic. Period. Measured all of human culture, all of human history against those periods that get imagined as.
Try that again. There we go. Okay. So at the least, it'll split into two separate files, but it should be one continuous one. It'll just treat this as a pause.
And if nothing else, Jason will get two Audacity tracks and go, there's a lot of them just rambling.
So
Okay.
what was the last thing?
I believe we were talking about the validity and legitimacy of written texts and oral traditions.
Yep.
Right. And I think it stopped just like just as I was ending my point. So
Okay. So you mentioned writing about the term Neoplatonism. What other current works in progress have you got, and what future projects do you have queued up
far too
upcoming?
many. I have been thinking more and more about starting a podcast, actually, which has been sort of a dream for a long time, but I always figured I would need a co-host. But I decided I'm just going to do it by myself. Um, yeah, and several dozen translations that I've started or want to start. Um, and there's an upcoming conference, the International Society for Neoplatonic Studies, that's going to be held in Athens this year. And I'm going to be giving a paper and co-organizing a panel about Neoplatonizing Latin literature.
Ooh.
Because usually the ISNS conferences are very Greek heavy, uh, for good reason, but the Latin tradition is also worth taking into account. Uh, and
Do you know if they're going to
I
stream
I
that?
don't think they will. No, they're
Oh,
uh,
okay.
very traditional in that regard. Old-fashioned,
Mhm.
I guess. Yeah.
So book your flights to
Yeah.
Athens
Yeah.
now.
Um, and my paper is going to be about specifically um, uh, sort of a small or a minor tradition of writing about the sun, basically, um, which gets discussed a lot of times as solar theology, um, and gets linked with Neoplatonism. And I'm going to be arguing that it's not really theological and it's not really to do with Neoplatonism, and it's more a tradition of hymnic writing. Um, and sort of that explains why it doesn't function like systematic theology, and why, even to the extent that it does show up in Neoplatonic writers, it doesn't have like a definite form or like a consistent Neoplatonic um, stamp on it. Um, and then it gets into some, pedantic philological points that I'm not gonna raise now. Yeah.
No spoilers. No, that's really cool. So, unless anyone else has a final question, one that I'm thinking of that you might say is potentially so big we should have opened with it, but is maybe a fun one to kind of end with, or at least fun for us, and hopefully for the listeners. For people looking at this who are much newer to paganism and are starting to hear about some bloke called Plato and all these kinds of things, how would you answer the question, why should they care about getting into philosophy and how it relates to becoming a pagan?
Um, Another very big question. How does it relate to being a pagan? Well, it doesn't necessarily. You can absolutely be a practicing
Mm-hmm.
pagan, um, without having a particular interest in philosophy, and you shouldn't feel pressured to get into it, uh, because of like a conception that maybe other people are selling you that this is like the things you should believe. That's not true. Um, but philosophy was considered maybe not quite the pinnacle of human thought, but it was considered a way of approaching the divine, of becoming like the divine. Um, and in that sense, maybe as I was saying about my research earlier, it is itself a kind of devotion. Now, whether it's a kind of devotion that you find yourself suited to is another question. But philosophy is also a very diverse sphere in itself. So you might not get something out of these very complicated, systematic treatises that you get from someone like Plotinus or Proclus. But maybe Plato himself is interesting to you because he's just a very good writer. Um, and some of his dialogues are less accessible than others, but he writes very beautifully. He's very poetic and just very beautiful ideas and images and scenes. Um, Aristotle is completely different from him, and then you have these moral philosophers like Seneca or Epictetus in the Stoic tradition, and again, they're completely different. Um, they use much more practical examples and language. Um, you have these sort of, I suppose, pop philosophers of the time, and Epictetus maybe is one of them, who don't get into all of these technical terms at all. Um, and yeah, it goes on. It's just a very diverse field, and if you don't like one thing, maybe just try something else. Um, I really like Sextus Empiricus, who was like the opposite of a Platonist. 'Cause Platonists always have a definite answer about everything, and and Sextus argues that you can't know anything at all, and all knowledge is false, and he does that very elegantly with all kinds of different uh, learning. So he criticizes grammar, he criticizes maths, he criticizes astronomy and music, and he criticizes all of the other philosophers. And so if you read him, you're both learning a lot and also learning why you shouldn't believe it.
No, that's really cool. So, as someone else who writes very elegantly and beautifully, where can people find your
Well,
work?
they can go to sartrix.org for my wiki, and I still have a WordPress blog that I'm trying to sort of move over all of my stuff from to the wiki, but that's going to be some time yet. And well, there's nowhere to find the podcast yet, but hopefully it won't be too long uh, until I'm able to share a first episode. I already have a topic in mind. It's going to be called the curious incident of the dog with the sex change. um, yeah.
Well, I I don't know how else to top that. I really appreciate you taking so much time out of your day to come and explore all these things with us and share your devotion and your work with us. This has been fun. This has been fascinating. And I really would encourage folks to check your website out. And I really just appreciate you spending so much time with us on this.
Thank you. It was a wonderful time, I have to say.
Excellent. So, beautiful people, Where can people find your things? Plug your pluggables, yes.
I mean, you can find my stuff at snowthegoth.com and everything else links from there.
You can find my stuff at streakingfate.wordpress.com. Sarenth?
You can find my stuff at sarth.wordpress.com. If you wish to commission me to write a topic or a prayer, you can find me at patreon.com/SarthOdinson. You can also find this show at aroundgrandfatherfire.com. You can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/aroundgrandfatherfire, facebook.com/aroundgrandfatherfire. You can also find us on bsky.app/profile/agfpodcast.bsky.social. You can find us on Instagram and Threads at agf.podcast. And you can find this podcast anywhere you get your normal podcasts from. We especially stream this to Spotify from our Patreon. So for both our patrons and our non-patrons, that's probably the easiest place to get our upcoming episodes. And I want to thank everybody who listens to the show and thank everybody who has supported the show. I also want to emphasize that we have a Discord that you do not need to be a Patreon member for. We appreciate our Patreon members, but you don't have to be a Patreon member in order to be part of the Discord. And you can find the link to our Discord at our website or on our Patreon as well. So I really, again, want to thank Gaia for joining us and for all of our wonderful listeners, both who are with us live and also who will be listening to this episode when it airs. And I want to thank you all for joining us, and we will see you next time around the fire.